Morning, everyone. Happy Sunday, and this is our sixth Sunday that we're doing something like this. My wife Jill and I are here on the front porch of the parsonage, and we are thankful that you are sharing your Sunday morning with us. Rather than think that of this day as the sixth Sunday that we haven't been in church, I would encourage us today to think of it this way. This is the third Sunday of Easter, according to the Christian calendar in the lectionary. And so I think it's much better if we think of it that way. This is the third Sunday of Easter, and we look forward as Easter people when we can come back together and worship again. This third Sunday of Easter has a scripture, and we'll get to that. It's from 1 Peter chapter 1, and it talks about change. And we talk a lot about change these days. We talk about, on the other side of this COVID-19, how things might change for us. So the theme is appropriate. I'm going to ask you to think a little bit about change today, and we'll get into that for a moment. I just want to thank our praise team. We were out of songs, and they gathered together yesterday, and they recorded some wonderful songs. So two of the songs that we have uploaded today is All My Hope Is in Jesus, and that features Scott Hovermail. It's a song that we love when Scott sings it. And then another song I really encourage you to listen to today is one of my favorite worship songs. It's called Breathe. We live in a time when we're all wearing face masks and about the air we breathe. And this song helps us think about our very breath and what it means to be in fellowship with God. Thank you, church and others, for the way you continue to support the ministry of Union Chapel. We continue to meet needs as we are able to do, and trust me, we are doing just that. And we've even began to plan for Vacation Bible School this summer. So just continue, church, to do all that you're doing. And thank you. So you may have noticed when I walked out here on the front porch, and you're going to hear some vehicles going by. It's just the way things is. We tried to stop traffic. They wouldn't let us. You may have noticed that I brought this apple dumpling out with me today. It's an apple dumpling from Shawnee Springs Market, and one of my favorite places to stop and get pie or apple dumplings and so on and so forth. You see, for me, if I'm going to talk about urges and desires, then I needed to bring that out here today, because Jill will tell you, normally I buy 3 or 4 or even 6 of them at a time, and the urge and the desire to eat all of them is just too great. And so I'm thankful that I just bought one for our time together today. Our lesson today speaks a lot about urges and desires. So let me ask you this question. Just take a deep breath and think. How am I doing with the urges and the desires in my life? Am I staying within the boundaries that I've set up for myself? You see, my boundaries for things like apple dumplings are just buy one, or just buy them and bring them into the house on special occasions when other people are here. And if there's anything left over, try as best you can to send those sweets home with those good folks. How are you doing with your boundaries? So let me get into the lesson from 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 13 through 23. And Peter is writing to a group of believers, the early church, that find themselves living within a culture that is contrary to the way of life that they have seen in Jesus, contrary and different from the way of life that God calls them into. And so Peter is calling them, this early group of believers, He's calling them to be different. He's calling them to live differently, to relate differently, to act differently. Let me read you some of this first from the NIV, the New International Version. Peter writes, as obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance, but just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all that you do, for it is written, be holy, because I, God, am holy. Now I want to read that same passage to you from Eugene Peterson's interpretation in the Message. Listen to that same passage in the wording. So roll up your sleeves, put your mind in gear, be totally ready to receive the gift that's coming when Jesus arrives. Do not lazily slip back into those old grooves of evil, just doing what you feel like doing. You didn't know better then, but you do now. So as obedient children, let yourselves be pulled into a way of life shaped by God's life, a life energetic and blazing with holiness. God said, I am holy, you be holy. So just think for a moment this morning, as we pause together, how has your relationship with Christ made you different? How has your relationship with Christ made you act differently? How has your relationship with Christ just made you different in every way? Allowing ourselves to be pulled into a new mindset, a new way of life, a new way of thinking, somehow able to resist those old temptations, Peter says, somehow able to resist new temptations. It's easier said than done. Whether it's sweets that we really don't need, that will just add inches to our waistline, or maybe it's a temptation that our soul doesn't need. That's exactly what Peter is saying. He's saying that somehow the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, somehow those three things together become our motivator to do just that. Somehow the life and death and resurrection of Jesus changes us. The idea was that people who belong to God live differently than everyone else. Not from a place that somehow we are more righteous or somehow we are better than everyone else, because the truth is we're not. But rather it was about an identity that somehow in living differently, that it would lead to a more fulfilled and meaningful and even a better life than what the culture calls us to. So Peter says, you know, church, in order to do this, sometimes, well, we need to have discipline in our lives. And certainly that relates to urges and desires as well. So let me ask you again, just to think about that question one more time. How are you doing with urges? How are you doing with the desires in your life? Has the recent celebration of Jesus, his resurrection from the dead, this third Sunday of Easter, has it inspired you? Has it motivated you? to be better today than you were yesterday? Has it inspired and motivated you and us to be better tomorrow than I was today? Peter says, allow yourself to be pulled into a way of life that is shaped by God's life, a life energetic and blazing with holiness. God said, I am holy, you be holy. So I was listening to another podcast. It's one of the ways that I've been passing this time. And I was listening to a psychologist, and he was talking about urges, especially as it relates to food. And he was talking about the tools that we already have. What he said really encouraged me. I just want to share a little bit of it with you. What he said is that we already have the basic tools that we need to resist unhealthy urges. We just need to apply that mindset and those tools to the areas of life where maybe we struggle with desires and urges. And he talked about that our mindset really has three levels of thinking or approach when it comes to urges and desires. And he said that the very first way that we approach it, you and I, is the most primitive or basic way of thinking. And he gave it a name. He called it the reptile man, if you can imagine, the reptile man way of thinking. And this is what he talked about in that basic, most primitive way of thinking. When a reptile sees something, it has three thoughts. Do I kill it? Do I eat it? Or do I mate with it? A little bit later on, at the end, I'll talk about a fourth way that maybe the reptile has, which is, do I run away from it? And that'll be at the end. But I want you to think about that most basic, primitive way of thinking when we see something that appeals to us. Do I kill it? Do I eat it? Do I mate with it? And then he said the second tier of thinking, that's a higher way of thinking. That second way of thinking asks those same three basic questions, but it also asks this other very important question. How will my decision about this urge and desire affect my tribe? How will my decision affect those around me that I care for and those that I love? I could eat this apple dumpling, but maybe Jill would like to have it. Maybe my mom would like to have it. Maybe you'd like to call me after this and say, Pastor Mike, I'll be stopping by for that apple dumpling. He says that second way of thinking is about community. It's about others. I think Jesus said it this way. Love one another just as I have loved you. I'm pretty sure that when it came to others, Jesus gave it all away. So far we have two ways of thinking about urges and desires. Kill it, eat it, mate with it. How will it affect those around me? And then he talked about the highest level of thinking, really the best way of thinking when it comes to urges and desires. And it asked all of those other questions that we already covered. But here is this higher level of thinking when it comes to urges and desires. And I'm going to show you in a minute a picture of one of my urges and desires. So here it is. Will this decision, my reaction to this urge or this desire, get me any closer to the goals of my life? Will it get me any closer to my understanding of what my purpose is? should I give in to this urge or desire? And to be honest, haven't we already, all of us have already learned the hard way? The answer to that sometimes is no. You see, I could eat this apple dumpling. I could deny it to those around me. But if I'm really honest, I don't need the extra calories. In fact, I need to lose some weight, because all of this extra weight is keeping me from some of the things I'd really like to be able to do and to accomplish physically. Now, an apple dumpling is one thing, but what about those big urges and those big desires? Well, he said, you can apply this to them. So let me ask you, have you seen the 2020 Ford Mustang GT 500 Shelby? Oh my goodness. Jill's going to show you a picture of that right now. Is that awesome or what? I mean, my basic desire is I have to have one of those. But then I begin to use these tools. Well, how would this affect those around me? Well, number one, Jill would kill me. Number two, I can't afford the $74,000 it takes to buy that vehicle. And number three, how it affects those around me. I'm pretty sure when I would drive that into the church parking lot, you all would begin to have some pretty interesting conversations about your pastor. And let me ask this question. Would owning that get me any closer to my purpose or goals in life? Well, the honest answer is no. He said we can use these tools and apply them to any area of life where there is an urge or desire. So Peter was writing to a church that was living in a culture that was contrary to the way and life of Jesus. And he was asking them and encouraging them and challenging them to live in a different manner to that culture. He was asking them to be different, to act different, and to relate different. He was asking them to be motivated out of the life and the death and the resurrection of Christ. To be motivated out of the understanding of all that God has already done for us and the ways that God loves us. He was asking them to be set apart because somehow we belong to God. And the idea today is still the same, that those who belong to God, well, we live differently. We have a higher calling to be like Jesus. That's our purpose in this life and the next. So I wonder on this third Sunday of Easter what might happen if we began asking ourselves, how would this decision, this urge, this desire, and the way I respond to it, how would it affect the people in my life? How would it affect the people in my church, in my community, in the world? What if we began to intentionally ask ourselves, will this get me any closer to the goals of my life? For my real purpose for being? Would it get me any closer to being like Jesus? You know what might happen if we respond in that way? Things might change. We might change for the better. So Peter says, church, roll up your sleeves. put your mind in gear. Be totally ready to receive the gift that's coming when Jesus arrives. Don't lazily slip back into those old ways of evil, just doing whatever you feel like doing. You didn't know any better then, but you do now. So as obedient children, let yourselves be pulled into a way of life that is shaped by God's life, that is shaped by the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. A life that is energetic and blazing with holiness. God said, I am holy. You be holy. And lastly, I said, maybe that basic or primitive or reptile man has really a fourth way of responding. Do I eat it? Do I kill it? Do I mate with it? And the fourth one I would add is, do I run away from it? Sometimes when we are faced with unhealthy urges and desires, maybe the best thing we can do is just turn in the other direction and run as far away from it as we can. I think the scriptures say it this way: flee evil, run from it, and it will serve us well. I hope you're motivated. I hope you're ready to roll up your sleeves and to be pulled into a new mindset when it comes to urges and the desires of our life. May God be with you, and I can't wait to see you again. Amen.